The Justice League voted to erase Batman's mind, and Batman found out. Before you follow the full weight of that sentence into the dark, settle into wherever you are right now. Feel the surface beneath you, its texture, its give, the particular way it holds you. Let your shoulders drop just slightly, because whatever tension you carried into this moment does not need to come any further with you. Breathe in slowly, and let the breath out even more slowly, and allow the space around you to grow a little quieter, a little softer. The story that waits ahead is a long one, and it will reach you at whatever pace your body needs. There is nowhere else to be. There is only this, the dark, the quiet, and the strange, painful, deeply human story of the most powerful team the world has ever known, and the secrets that hollowed it from within. The Justice League, in its earliest and most luminous form, was built on something that sounds almost naive when you hold it up to the light now. It was built on trust. Not the cautious, provisional trust of governments or corporations, the kind of trust that arrives preloaded with escape clauses and liability frameworks, but something rarer and more fragile. The trust of people who had each looked into the face of genuine catastrophe and chosen to stand between it and everyone else. Superman, Diana, Batman, the Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, Martian Manhunter. 7 individuals of almost incomprehensible capability, each carrying the full weight of a separate mythology, choosing to orbit the same conviction, that together they could protect a world that neither fully understood them nor entirely deserved the protection. It is worth sitting with what that founding arrangement actually meant. Superman was, in the most literal sense, an alien god who had decided to live among people weaker than himself and call them family. Diana was a warrior from a civilization that had spent centuries watching humanity's capacity for self-destruction with justified skepticism, and had come anyway, armed with both a sword and an unsentimental compassion. Bruce Wayne, Batman, was a man who had watched his parents die in an alley when he was 8 years old, and had spent every year since building himself into something that catastrophe could not touch. The Flash carried the burden of a speed so vast that ordinary human experience, grief, joy, the passage of an afternoon, sometimes felt to him like watching the world through glass. Aquaman governed an empire beneath the ocean that contained 70% of the planet's surface. Martian Manhunter was the last survivor of an entire civilization, carrying the loneliness of a species-ending loss that no human language had words sufficient to describe. These were not people for whom the word trust was a light or casual thing. These were people who had each learned, through experiences that would have destroyed lesser minds, that the world was not reliably safe, that power was not reliably benevolent, and that even the people you loved most were capable of failing you in ways that left permanent marks. For these people to build something on trust was not the act of innocence. It was the act of those who knew exactly what trust cost and had decided to pay it anyway. The watchtower floated above the Earth in geosynchronous orbit, a structure visible from the ground on clear nights as a bright and steady point of light that looked, to anyone who noticed it, like a star that had decided to stay in one place. From inside, the view was the opposite. The whole curved surface of the planet spread below like a painting that never stopped moving. The slow rotation of continents, the bright seams of city lights tracing the shapes of human civilization across the dark. Johns, the Martian Manhunter, often spent the quiet hours between crises at the observation window, and no one who saw him there ever asked what he was thinking. Some grief is recognizable across species. The early years of the League's operation produced victories that seemed, at the time, to confirm the founding logic. Alien invasions repelled, dimensional incursions contained, cosmic entities turned back from a planet they had casually intended to consume. The roster expanded as the need expanded. Other heroes added their capabilities and their particular mythologies to the League's collective weight. The signal went out, the heroes came, and the world continued to exist in the aftermath of things that should have ended it. There was a rhythm to it, a reassurance, the sense that as long as the 7, or the 12, or the 20, depending on the crisis, stood together, the worst possibilities would remain possibilities rather than facts. What no one said aloud, because saying it aloud would have required acknowledging a vulnerability that felt dangerous to name, was that the team's greatest strength and its greatest weakness were the same thing. The same extraordinary capability that made each member irreplaceable in a crisis also made each member, in moments of conflict or misjudgment, an actor whose errors operated at a scale that ordinary human error simply did not reach. When Batman misjudged a situation, the consequences were not the consequences of a man getting something wrong. They were the consequences of a mind of exceptional capability, working from the particular blind spots that exceptional capability tended to produce, getting something wrong in a way that reverberated through systems designed around the assumption that he would get it right. The same was true, differently inflected for each of them. Superman's moral certainty, his profound, sometimes aching conviction that the right thing existed and could be found and should be done, was the quality that made him the irreplaceable centre of the team's moral architecture. It was also, at the edges, the quality that occasionally made him dangerous. A man who is certain he knows what is right and who can shatter mountains with his bare hands occupies a position that does not have a lot of natural checks on it. The checks, such as they existed, lived in the relationships, in Diana's willingness to tell him when his certainty had curdled into rigidity, in Bruce's capacity to hold the contingency plans that he hoped would never be used, in the accumulated weight of a team that could, at least in theory, hold each other accountable. The question that would eventually split the League open was not a dramatic one. It arrived quietly, the way the most consequential questions often do, in the form of a situation that seemed manageable until it wasn't. A villain, the Key, had used a psychotropic device to trap the League in a fantasy world, each member living inside a dream constructed from their deepest psychological material. The League escaped, eventually, through the particular combination of individual willpower and collective cleverness that had always been their signature. The villain was defeated. The crisis resolved. What remained, in the aftermath, was a detail that most accounts of the incident passed over quickly. The Key's device had not simply created the dreams. It had, in doing so, drawn on information about each Leaguer's deepest fears, most private vulnerabilities, and most carefully guarded psychological architecture. Information that should not have been accessible. Information that suggested to anyone paying close enough attention that someone had either given it access or had been inside the team's most protected spaces. Batman noticed. Batman, in the particular way that Batman noticed things, quietly, completely, filing the observation into the elaborate internal architecture that was his primary residence, noticed and began to ask questions that no one else thought to ask. The answers he found were not the answers he expected, and what came after those answers was not a crisis that arrived from outside the League. It was the first tremor of something that had been building from within, in the silence between certainties, in the gap between what the team said to each other and what each member carried alone. The story of how the Justice League destroyed itself from within begins exactly there. Not with a villain, not with an invasion, not with any of the cosmic catastrophes they had been built to face. It begins with a secret, and with the question of who decides what to do when the people who are supposed to protect everyone cannot agree on how to protect each other. Rest in that question for a moment. Let it settle without demanding an answer. The night is long, and the story is patient, and the next chapter begins where trust ends. The Watchtower's construction was not a bureaucratic decision. It was a statement, perhaps the most public statement the League ever made about how it understood itself and its place in the world. To build a structure in orbit visible to the naked eye on clear nights as a fixed point of light that moved with the precision of something that had been placed rather than born, was to announce a permanent presence. It was to say, we are not emergency responders who arrive when summoned. We are a standing institution. We are here before you need us, and we will be here when the need passes. The deliberateness of that statement carried within it a weight of presumption that the League's members did not fully examine at the time of construction, because the urgency of the work made examination feel like the kind of luxury that only the unoccupied could afford. Clark Kent's relationship to his adopted planet was more complicated than the mythology built around him was designed to accommodate. He had grown up in Smallville, Kansas, raised by Jonathan and Martha Kent with a directness of love that the American heartland seemed, in the particular telling of his story, to produce as naturally as the corn grew in the flat fields around their farm. He knew what it felt like to belong somewhere. He also knew, in the private chambers of his experience, what it felt like to be something that the somewhere he belonged to was not entirely equipped to understand. The people of Earth were his people. Their vulnerability was his vulnerability, or at least the category of thing he treated as his own vulnerability. But there were nights when the vastness of his perception, the ability to hear, at low concentration, the heartbeat of the planet, the simultaneous cacophony of 8 billion human lives in their countless private urgencies, produced in him something that was not quite loneliness and not quite alienation, but was the specific feeling of standing at a slight remove from the thing you love most, close enough to know it completely, and separated from it by the unbridgeable fact of what you are. The question of who holds the most power in any group of extraordinary individuals is not always the question of who can do the most physical damage. Power in the register that the League operated in was more diffuse and more interesting than that simple calculation. John Johns could read minds and shapeshift and phase through solid matter, and achieve strengths that approached Superman's own in certain configurations, but his power in the group's internal dynamic was quieter than these capabilities suggested. He was, in many ways, the team's conscience, not in the preachy, declarative sense that the word conscience sometimes implies, but in the structural sense that he was the one most likely to notice when a decision was being made too quickly, when the emotional climate of a meeting was producing conclusions that the cooler light of subsequent reflection might not support. His position as the last of his kind gave him a perspective on civilizational mortality that the others found difficult to fully access. He knew, with a completeness that none of them could match, what it looked like when a society failed itself from within. The early crises that the League faced together did something to each of the founding members that was neither entirely positive nor entirely negative, but that was inevitable. It raised the threshold of what they could tolerate. The first time you stand between your planet and an alien armada, the experience is transformative in ways that reach all the way down into the architecture of the self. It changes your relationship to fear, to risk, to the question of what constitutes an emergency worthy of mobilizing everything you have. The transformation is mostly productive. It builds a capacity for response that makes you more effective, more reliable, better at the work. But it also, in a more subtle register, makes it harder to attend to the smaller things. The crises that did not look like armadas. The harms that accumulated in the spaces between events, large enough to trigger the League's full response. The seeds of the most dangerous problems the team would ever face were planted in exactly those spaces. The first years of the League produced something that none of the founding members had explicitly intended, and that all of them, in different ways, had needed: a community. Not the managed professional alliance of people who share a mission and maintain appropriate distance from each other, but something more genuine and more complicated. A community in the true sense. A set of relationships thick enough with shared experience, shared humour, shared grief, and shared triumph, to constitute a world that existed alongside the public world, and that was, in many ways, more real than the public world to the people living inside it. The Watchtower was where they ate together, where they argued and repaired arguments, where they appeared in each other's company without the specific armour that the work required. It was where they were, to whatever extent beings of this kind could be ordinary. Ordinary. Batman had a plan to defeat every member of the Justice League. He had been refining it for years. Let that land gently, the way it would have landed on Superman or Diana or the Flash if they had known. Not as an explosion, but as a slow, cold understanding. Bruce Wayne had sat in the Watchtower with these people, had bled beside them, had attended their weddings and their funerals and the quiet dinners that happened in the margins of catastrophe. The moments that do not appear in any official record but that constitute the actual texture of what it means to belong to something. And through all of it, in the private chamber of his analytical mind, he had been building the architecture of their defeat. Breathe in slowly. Feel the weight of the air in your lungs. The story you're inside now is not a comfortable one, but comfort is not what brought you here. What brought you here is the deeper thing. The need to understand how people who love each other in their particular way, who depend on each other in the most extreme circumstances human beings can construct, can also be the source of each other's most devastating harm. The Justice League's story is that story, told at the scale of gods. The contingency plans had a name, though Batman had never shared it with anyone: the Tower of Babel Protocols. The name itself was revealing, a reference to the biblical story of a structure ambitious enough to touch the divine, brought down not by external force but by the simple dissolution of shared language, the moment when the builders could no longer understand each other, and the tower became impossible. Batman had chosen that name with the precision he brought to everything. He understood that the League's greatest vulnerability was not any enemy it faced, but the possibility that the team itself might one day need to be stopped, and that no one would be capable of stopping it if the mechanisms for doing so did not already exist. The logic was not insane. In the cold, clear light of Bruce's analytical framework, the logic was actually sound. The League's members were individuals of extraordinary power, and extraordinary power is not permanently guaranteed to remain aligned with human welfare. Superman could be mind-controlled. It had happened. Diana could be corrupted by magical manipulation. The mechanisms existed. The Flash could be weaponized by anyone with sufficient understanding of the Speed Force. Green Lantern's ring was only as reliable as the will and judgment of the person wearing it. These were not hypotheticals. These were things that had either happened or that the available evidence suggested were possible. The question of what to do if a League member went rogue was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a contingency that responsible planning required. What made the Tower of Babel protocol something other than reasonable crisis management was the particular intimacy of the information they contained. Batman had not simply assessed the League's general capabilities and theorized about their weaknesses. He had observed over years of working alongside each member the specific psychological and physical vulnerabilities that only someone in his position could access. He knew that Superman's adoptive parents represented a leverage point so deep that threatening them could paralyze him regardless of his physical invulnerability. He knew the precise electromagnetic frequencies that could override Martian Manhunter's cellular control. He knew the exact sequence of sensory triggers that would most efficiently incapacitate each member. The plans were not abstract, they were intimate, they were the weaponization of friendship. Ra's al Ghul found them. This was the second terrible thing, that the plans Batman had constructed as a safeguard were stolen by a villain of extraordinary capability and turned into an actual attack on the League. Ra's, whose relationship with Batman was its own complex archive of respect and enmity, and the particular bond that forms between opponents who have studied each other for decades, had identified the contingency files in the Batcave's most secure directory, and extracted them with a thoroughness that suggested he had been planning the theft for some time. He then deployed them. Each League member was targeted through the exact vulnerability that Batman had identified. The attacks were not random or clumsy, they were surgical. They worked because they had been designed by someone who knew the targets better than any enemy could. Superman was exposed to red kryptonite that affected his mind rather than his body, stripping away his inhibitions and releasing the suppressed awareness of just how easily he could destroy the world he was trying to protect. The Flash was trapped in a state of artificial acceleration, not unconscious, not immobilized, but vibrating at a frequency that placed him outside of normal time, alive and aware in a private universe where no communication with the outside world was possible. Aquaman was subjected to a form of psychological attack that exploited the oceanic depth of his sensory connection to water, inducing a phobia so total that contact with any liquid became agony. John Johns was set alight in a way calibrated to his specific terror of fire. Green Lantern's will, the foundation of his power, was methodically undermined through carefully constructed illusions designed from Bruce's understanding of the psychological architecture that Hal Jordan's willpower both rested on and concealed. They survived. The League, collectively and individually, found ways to survive the attacks that Batman's protocols had made possible. The Flash vibrated himself free. Superman's friends reached him before the worst possibilities materialized. The others endured what they had to endure and came through the other side carrying the particular quality of damage that leaves no visible mark. They came through, and they came together again, and then came the moment that Batman had not planned for, the moment when the team sat in a room together with the full knowledge of what had happened, and what Bruce had kept from them, and what that keeping had made possible. The vote to expel Batman from the Justice League passed. It was not unanimous. It was never entirely clear in the aftermath whether the members who voted against expulsion were making a judgment about justice or a judgment about necessity, whether they believed Bruce's actions had been defensible or simply believed that the League without Batman was a worse problem than the League with a Batman who had done this. The debate was short, because the wounds were too fresh for the kind of extended deliberation that the question deserved. The vote happened, and Bruce accepted it without protest, which was itself a kind of answer to the question of whether he believed he had been wrong. He did not believe he had been wrong, he believed he had been exposed. The distinction in Bruce's internal architecture was a significant one. The plans had been necessary. The theft had been a failure of his security. The deployment against the League had been Ra's al Ghul's crime, not his own. And yet, in the long nights that followed, in the silence of the Batcave without the Watchtower connection humming in the background, Bruce sat with something that his analytical framework had difficulty categorizing. Not guilt, exactly, not regret. Something more specific and more uncomfortable, the awareness that he had trusted the League with his life and his labour, and the particular quality of devotion that was the closest thing his psychology produced to love, and had simultaneously believed, at the level where plans were made and kept secret, that they could not be trusted with the truth of what he thought they might one day become. The question of what that said about him was one he was still asking in the long silences, when no crisis demanded his attention. The world still turned, the League still functioned, and somewhere in the space between the members who remained and the one who had left, a new understanding had taken hold, that the team's greatest strength had always been built on ground that was not as solid as it looked. What else, the remaining members began to ask, had been kept hidden? What else, lurking in the architecture of their shared work, had been built from the assumption that knowledge was safer when it wasn't shared? The archive of contingency plans that Batman maintained was organized with the same precision he applied to everything, indexed not alphabetically or chronologically, but according to a taxonomy of threat scenarios that had its own internal logic, a logic that reflected the particular way Bruce's mind organized risk. Each file contained not just the tactical information about the specific League member's vulnerabilities, but a psychological assessment, a detailed portrait of the mental and emotional landscape that the physical or technological attack would be deployed against. The psychological assessments were, in many ways, more disturbing than the attack mechanisms themselves. They demonstrated how deeply Bruce had observed each of his colleagues, how completely he had mapped the interior terrain of their minds, and they demonstrated this through the particular quality of accuracy that could only come from extended, careful, genuine attention. He had written these portraits not as an adversary studying a target, but as a partner studying a partner, which was what made them so useful, and what made their existence so damaging to the trust that their accuracy was a product of. The Flash's reaction to the discovery of the contingency plans contained a particular quality of hurt that the other members' reactions did not quite match. This was partly because Wally West's relationship to the concept of betrayal was inflected by his experience as a member of a community, the extended family of speedsters, the tradition of the Flash mantle, that he had always understood as one of the League's most reliable models of functional trust. The Flash tradition had always seemed to him to operate with a generosity and transparency that he privately held as a counterexample to the more guarded operating styles of other League members. To discover that the person he had worked alongside most closely had built a detailed map of how to destroy him, not as an exercise but as an operational document, maintained and updated, was a specific kind of violation that took a long time to fully absorb. Ra's al Ghul's decision to steal and deploy the Tower of Babel protocols was not made impulsively. This is worth emphasizing because the temptation in telling this story is to focus on the theft, as though it were the operative event, the thing that made the contingency plans dangerous. But Ra's had been studying Bruce Wayne for years before he identified the files, and he had been planning the deployment for months before he executed it. The sophistication of his approach reflected both his exceptional intelligence and his exceptional patience. The patience of someone who has lived long enough to understand that the most effective attacks are not the ones that arrive fastest, but the ones that arrive at the exact moment when the defenses are configured in the particular way that leaves the specific gap you have identified. The vote to expel Batman was conducted without his presence, which was itself a procedural choice with its own ethical dimension. Some members argued that he should be in the room, that whatever the outcome, the principle of facing the person you were judging was both fair and necessary. Others argued that his presence would make the deliberation impossible, that the quality of analysis and argument that Bruce could bring to any discussion would make a genuine assessment of the evidence effectively impossible. The decision to proceed without him was made on pragmatic grounds that had a certain logic and that also represented, in its small way, the same kind of unilateral decision-making that was the underlying subject of the vote. The team held Bruce accountable for deciding things without the team's knowledge. They did it in a meeting he was not invited to. The irony was noted by some of the members and noted in silence. The specific quality of the moment when the League voted on Batman's expulsion was shaped by the awareness, shared among all present, that they were making a decision whose full implications none of them had processed. The vote was not cathartic. It did not produce the resolution that formal processes sometimes produce, the sense that an accounting has been made and something has been settled. What it produced instead was a new configuration of uncertainty, a new arrangement of the unresolved elements that the original crisis had introduced. Bruce's absence from the League left a gap that the team could not ignore, because the gap was not simply the absence of his specific capabilities, but the absence of the particular quality of attention he brought to the team's work. The attention that noticed the things no one else noticed, asked the questions no one else thought to ask, maintained the vigilance that the team had always needed and had always quietly relied upon, without fully acknowledging the reliance. 7 members of the Justice League voted to perform a lobotomy on a villain. Then they voted to make each other forget. Let that settle. You do not need to do anything with it yet. Just allow it to exist in the room with you. That sentence and all the weight it carries. The night is soft around you, and this story is one that deserves to be held carefully, the way you hold something that is both fragile and heavy. Breathe. Let the next few minutes carry you deeper into the thing that the Justice League tried, for years, to carry in silence. The incident that would later be called the identity crisis. The name came from the way it called into question not just what the team had done, but who the team was, who any of them were beneath the certainties they wore in public. Began with the death of Sue Dibney. Sue was the wife of Ralph Dibney, the elongated man, a detective of considerable capability, and a League member whose particular gift for warmth and human connection had made him something like the team's emotional centre. Sue was not a metahuman. She was a woman who had chosen to share her life with a man who could stretch his body into impossible configurations, who had moved through the world of costumed heroes with a grounded good humour and a genuine love for the strange community her marriage had placed her inside. She was found dead in their home, and the investigation that followed uncovered something that a significant portion of the League had been protecting together in silence for years. The secret had originated with Dr. Light, Arthur Light, a villain whose career had been defined by a particular cowardly viciousness, a willingness to inflict maximum damage with minimum risk to himself. He had broken into the watchtower and committed an act of terrible violence against Sue Dibney when he found her alone there. He had been captured by the League afterward, and then, in the extraordinary private crisis of that moment, the rage and the grief and the particular horror of realizing that the sanctity of their most protected space had been violated in the worst possible way, a group of 7 League members had convened without telling the full roster to decide what to do. Zatanna had the power to do it. The word lobotomy is clinical and perhaps slightly misleading for what actually occurred. The technical reality was a magical reconstruction of Dr. Light's personality architecture, a deep intervention in the structure of who he was at the psychological level, designed to diminish the qualities that had produced the harm he'd done. The intent was protection. The intent was to take something that the law could not reliably contain and make it smaller, safer, less capable of the specific kind of harm it had demonstrated. The intent, as intents often are, was completely understandable and also completely wrong. The 7 members who voted for the procedure did not vote easily. The record of that discussion, pieced together years later from the individual accounts of those who were present, suggests a genuine moral struggle, not the rubber stamp of people who had already decided, but the specific anguish of people who understood what they were considering and chose to do it anyway. Some of them had doubts that they voiced. All of them had doubts that they held back. The final vote was not unanimous, but the majority held, and Zatanna did what the majority had decided, and Dr. Light's mind was changed. Sit with this for a moment. The people who made this decision were not villains. They were not indifferent to the weight of what they were doing. Several of them had spent their adult lives defined by the principle that the end does not justify the means. that the way you fight matters as much as what you fight for, perhaps more, and they had made this decision anyway. This is the part of the story that does not have a clean interpretation, that resists the kind of moral tidying that makes history easier to hold. The people in that room were the same people who flew into burning buildings and stood between their world and extinction. They were also the people who made this choice. Both of those things are true at the same time. The memory modification did not stop with Dr. Light. This is the detail that the League found hardest to absorb when it finally came out. Not the original act, which was terrible enough, but the evidence that the procedure had become a practice. In the years following the Dr. Light incident, at least 9 other individuals had been subjected to similar magical alterations of memory or personality. Some of them were villains who had discovered League members' secret identities. Some of them were people whose knowledge the group had decided, in the quiet chambers of their private judgment, constituted a risk that needed to be managed. The logic of each individual decision was, from inside the decision, understandable. The accumulated pattern of those decisions was something that the logic of each individual case had concealed. Batman had been there for the original vote. He had voted against it, one of the minority who said no, who looked at what was being proposed and said that this was not something the League had the right to do. And then, after the vote had passed, and the procedure had been performed, Zatanna had altered his memory as well. Not of the vote, he knew he had voted no, but of what he had witnessed in the immediate aftermath. A detail, they had decided, that he did not need to carry. A detail that had been removed from the careful architecture of the most analytical mind in the League by the hands of people who had decided they knew better. The modern echo of this is something you might recognise, not in the scale but in the shape. The feeling of being managed by people who care about you. The particular quality of the moment when you discover that someone made a decision about what you should or should not know, and made it without asking and justified it to themselves with your best interests. The Justice League, in its most human moment, had done to each other what controlling people do to those they love. They had decided that their judgment about what was safe to know was more reliable than the other person's right to know it. And the damage that decision produced was not proportional to the scale of power involved. It was the same damage, the same rupture, the same aftermath. Sue Dibney's death opened the old wound. The investigation revealed what had been done, and the League that had held together through alien invasions and dimensional catastrophes, and the theft of Batman's contingency plans, found itself standing on a question it had no protocol for. What do you do when the corruption is not something that arrived from outside, but something that grew in the dark from the seeds of your own good intentions? The answer, it turned out, was harder than anything the League had ever been asked to face, because the answer required looking, with full honesty, at what they had become. The decision to alter Dr. Light's personality was made in a room whose atmosphere was unlike any Justice League meeting that had come before it. The normal register of the team's deliberations, analytical, structured, characterized by a kind of high-stakes rationality that processed even extreme situations through frameworks designed to keep the analysis clean, was absent. What was present instead was something rawer and less comfortable, the particular emotional state of people who have encountered violence done to someone they know, and who are sitting with the gap between what justice means in theory and what it feels like to want when the abstract becomes personal. The discussion that produced the vote was real moral deliberation. It was also conducted by people who were in a state in which moral deliberation was at its most difficult. Zatanna Zatara's position in the League had always been slightly different from the other members, in ways that the rest of the team did not always fully register. She was a professional performer before she was a superhero, someone who had spent years working in the specific context of theatrical magic, where the relationship between what is real and what is presented as real is the fundamental subject matter and also the fundamental ethical minefield. She understood, better than almost anyone in the League, the potential for abuse that lived in the gap between appearance and reality. She also understood, from her tradition and her training, the specific weight of magical action that bypasses consent, the moral traditions around compulsion and alteration that the serious practice of her art had required her to engage with in ways that more physically oriented heroes had not. The decision to cast the spell was, for her, more than a strategic choice. It was an act with a history she could not ignore, performed in circumstances that made that history feel necessary rather than cautionary. The member who was perhaps most visibly altered by the full disclosure of the identity crisis events was Ralph Dibney. This requires a particular kind of care in its description, because Ralph's experience was the most intimate of all. It was his wife whose violation had precipitated the original decision, his loss that the secret had been organised around protecting, his grief that had been managed by colleagues who had decided, without his knowledge, how much he should know. To discover, in the aftermath of Sue's death, that the events of years earlier had been handled in a way that centred the protection of the secret over his right to know what had happened in his own life, that his colleagues had made decisions about what he should carry and what they would carry for him, decisions that had never been discussed with him, was a rupture that operated at a level of intimacy that none of the League's other crises had quite reached. He had trusted these people with the most private dimensions of his life. The trust had not been reciprocated in the form it deserved. The question of Batman's erased memory, the detail that Zatanna had removed from Bruce's recollection of the evening's aftermath, produced a specific quality of response in him that was different from the rage or grief that other members displayed. What Bruce felt, or what he acknowledged feeling, was something more precise. The recognition that the thing he had spent his entire career most afraid of had been done to him by people who cared about him. The argument for what had been done, that it was a small alteration, a single detail, performed by people whose intentions were protective, was exactly the kind of argument that Bruce had spent years developing the analytical frameworks to resist. The claim that benevolent intent justifies intrusion into another person's mind without consent is a claim that can be used to justify anything. Bruce knew this. He had built his entire philosophy of accountability around the awareness that it could be used to justify anything. To have it used on him, by people applying it in good faith, was the confirmation of every dark inference his vigilance had ever produced. The question of what constitutes justice, when the mechanisms of formal law are inadequate to the scale of the harm, is not one that the League's discussion in the aftermath of the Dr. Light incident resolved. It is one that the incident forced into the open in a way that the team had previously managed to avoid by not encountering circumstances quite this extreme. The abstract version of the question, what do you do when the law cannot provide sufficient protection, had existed in the background of every League member's career, because every League member had spent years working in the gap between what was legal and what was necessary. But the abstract version had always resolved into the same practical answer. You push the law as far as it will go, and then you accept that the law's limits are also your limits. The Dr. Light situation produced the first case where the team, collectively, could not make that answer hold. The years that followed the identity crisis disclosure were marked by a quality of altered relationship among the League's members that was not exactly distrust and not exactly trust, but something in between, a suspension of certainty, a provisional quality in interactions that had previously felt more settled. The members who had been involved in the original decision moved carefully around the members who had not known, aware of the weight of what they carried and of the ways in which the weight showed. The members who had not known moved carefully in the other direction, aware that their colleagues were aware of their awareness, producing a kind of recursive discomfort that was not reducible to any single emotion but that pervaded the team's working atmosphere in the same way that unaddressed grief pervades a family's ordinary life, present in everything, named in almost nothing. There was another Superman watching from outside the universe. He had been watching for years, and he had decided that the League had failed. The room around you is quiet. The dark is easy. Let your body settle a little further into where it rests, and let the story continue at the pace of something that does not need to hurry. The next chapter of the League's unravelling is a cosmic one. It reaches beyond the Earth and beyond the normal borders of what physics considers possible. But at its centre, as at the centre of all the crises that fractured the League, there is something very small and very human. The belief that a better world is possible, and the willingness to destroy the existing one in pursuit of it. The original crisis on Infinite Earths had collapsed the DC multiverse into a single Earth, a single timeline, a single history. The beings responsible for that collapse, the superhero Kal-El of Earth 2, his wife Lois, the hero Superboy Prime, and Alexander Luthor Jr. of Earth 3, had been placed afterward in a pocket dimension outside the normal universe. They had been placed there with the understanding that their sacrifice had made the new world possible, that the world they were watching from outside the glass was the world their sacrifice had earned. They had been watching ever since. What Kal-El, the older Superman, the one who predated the modern version by decades, whose every feature carried the weathering of a life lived at a pace the younger Clark Kent had not yet reached, saw when he looked at the world his sacrifice had made was not what he had been promised. He saw a world growing darker. He saw heroes making the choices that the League's internal history recorded, the contingency plans, the memory alterations, the incremental drift from the clear moral architecture of his own era towards something murkier and more compromised. He saw his wife Lois fading, not dying in any ordinary sense, but diminishing in the way that things diminish, when the reality that contains them loses its coherence, and he decided with the particular conviction of a man who had given everything for a specific outcome and watched that outcome become something else, that the world he was watching did not deserve to continue. Alexander Luthor had been doing mathematics while the old Superman grieved. Alexander was a different kind of mind entirely, not the passionate moral actor that Kal-El represented, but a cold architect of outcomes, someone for whom the universe was a problem to be solved rather than a home to be cherished. His calculations had produced a conclusion. The single universe that had replaced the multiverse was not the best possible universe. The crisis that had ended the multiverse had collapsed infinite possibilities into one arbitrary result. The multiverse could be reconstructed. A better Earth could be selected from the infinite variety of Earths that had once existed. The process of selecting it would require a certain amount of destruction, specifically the destruction of the current Earth, the one that the League was standing on, but the mathematics suggested the trade was sound. Superboy Prime was the third component, and in some ways the most painful one. He was a Superman from a world that had contained no superheroes except him, a Clark Kent from Earth Prime, the world closest to ours, who had possessed all of Superman's power and none of Superman's history of using it. He was young in the way that idealism is young before it encounters the resistance of the actual world. He had believed, when he entered the pocket dimension, that he was making a heroic sacrifice for a better outcome. What he found in the years of watching was not heroism but imprisonment, not sacrifice but slow corrosion. The world he watched did not honour his sacrifice. It did not even know about it. And the anger that accumulated in him during those years of watching took the particular form that unrewarded idealism's anger always takes. The conviction that the people who failed to honour the sacrifice deserved to suffer for the failure. The three of them broke out of the pocket dimension. The mechanism of the breakout is a story in itself, layered, technically intricate in the way that crises operating at the multiverse level tend to be. But the emotional core of it was simpler. Three people who had given everything, who had been promised something in return, who had watched through the glass as what they had been promised became something else, and who had finally decided to take matters into their own hands. The universe they were about to re-enter was not prepared for what they carried, not because of their power, though the power was real and extraordinary, but because of the particular quality of the wound they were bringing with them, the wound of disappointed love, the wound of sacrifice that had not produced the promised return. The Justice League that faced them was not the League of the founding years. It was a league that had already been damaged from within, by the Tower of Babel revelations, by the identity crisis disclosures, by the accumulated weight of all the secrets and decisions and private judgments that had not been shared with the full team. It was a league in which trust was already a complicated concept, in which the space between members was already threaded with the fine wires of unsaid things. Facing a threat of this magnitude, a threat that operated at the level of reality itself, required exactly the kind of unified clarity that the team had spent years quietly dismantling. The infinite crisis that followed was catastrophic in the way that only events operating at this scale can be catastrophic. Multiple Earths flickered into existence and out again. History was rewritten in ways that left traces in the memories of those present, the particular cognitive vertigo of remembering two different versions of the same event simultaneously. Heroes died in ways that did not respect the normal narrative logic of heroic death. The casualties were enormous, not just in the register of physical harm, but in the register of certainty, of the reliable sense that the world had a coherent structure that could be understood and defended. What the Infinite Crisis revealed about the Justice League was something that the Tower of Babel and the Identity Crisis had begun to sketch, and that this catastrophe completed in full. The team had been operating for years on the assumption that its internal tensions were manageable, that the secrets and the votes and the choices that had not been made in full transparency were sustainable as long as the external crises were being handled. The Infinite Crisis demonstrated that the external crises were not separable from the internal ones. The vulnerability of a team that did not trust itself fully was not a background condition that had to be worked around. It was an active weakness that opponents could, and did, exploit directly. Alexander Luthor's plan had depended at a structural level on the League being divided. He had been watching long enough to know the fracture lines. He had built his strategy around them with the particular efficiency of someone who has had years to study a system's failure modes and has decided to use those failure modes as load-bearing elements of his own design. The League's internal history had given him exactly what he needed. The crisis was ultimately resolved, not cleanly and not without cost, and not in a way that left the survivors entirely certain about what had been saved or what had been lost in the saving of it. But the resolution was not the most important thing the Infinite Crisis produced. The most important thing it produced was a reckoning, a forced acknowledgement among the heroes who remained that the way they had been operating was not sustainable, that the next crisis of this magnitude would find them, if they continued as they were, exactly as vulnerable as this one had. Something had to change. The question was whether they were capable of changing it. Alexander Luthor's years inside the pocket dimension had given him something that most of the DC Universe's most capable minds lacked: uninterrupted time to think. The particular quality of his intelligence, a combination of Lex Luthor's cunning and the moral clarity that his Earth-3 origin had not provided him with, channeled through the experience of watching a world from outside it, had in those years produced a theory of reality that was both technically rigorous and deeply wrong, in a way that technical rigor can sometimes make more dangerous rather than less. He had convinced himself, with the thoroughness of someone who had had nothing to do but examine his own conclusions, that the mathematics of reality selection was a neutral process, that choosing one Earth over another was not meaningfully different from choosing one configuration of a system over another. The beings whose existence the unchosen Earths would have contained were, in his framework, not so much destroyed as never having been realized. The distinction was important to him. It was the kind of distinction that allowed him to proceed. The older Superman, Kal-El of Earth 2, carried a quality of grief that the modern Clark Kent had not yet accumulated because he had not yet lived the life that produced it. He had been a Superman longer. He had seen more, lost more, watched the accumulated evidence of decades that even the most complete devotion to goodness could not prevent certain kinds of loss. His wife's fading in the pocket dimension had the particular quality of a death that never finished. She was diminishing but had not gone, present but increasingly not there, and the witnessing of it had stripped away whatever optimism or capacity for hope about outcomes that his long career had not already worn down. He was not evil. He was in many ways the League's most tragic figure, the version of the story in which the hero simply lived long enough to lose the things that the hero's mythology is built around protecting. The heroes who were lost during the Infinite Crisis deserve to be named, not catalogued. Superboy, Con-El, Connor Kent, a young man who had been built from the DNA of two of the universe's most extraordinary individuals, and who had spent his brief life trying to understand what he was and who he wanted to be, died holding together a machine designed to destroy everything, holding it until the crisis passed and he could no longer hold it. The death of young heroes carries a different quality from the death of older ones, not because the young lives were more valuable, but because they contain a different kind of loss, the loss of everything that was going to be, rather than everything that was. Connor Kent was still figuring out what he was going to be. That figuring out was the thing that ended. The aftermath of the Infinite Crisis produced a year of adjustment that the League experienced in a dispersed and disoriented state. Some members took sabbaticals, some retreated into more localized operations, working at smaller scales after the cosmic dimensions of the recent conflict. The Watchtower orbited without the usual density of occupation, its observation windows dark more often than lit. This period of diffusion, known, in the records that the team maintained as the 1 year later period, was not simply recovery. It was the space in which each member, individually and without the structure of collective deliberation to contain the processing, worked through what the infinite crisis had produced in them. The conclusions they reached in that individual processing were not uniform. They were not, in all cases, the conclusions that subsequent events suggested would have been most useful. The heroes who gathered to face the infinite crisis did so knowing that they were more divided than they had ever been entering a conflict of this magnitude. The awareness of their division was not something that could be set aside for the duration of the crisis and returned to afterward, the way you might set aside a difficult conversation to deal with a more immediate emergency. The division was itself a condition of the crisis, a structural feature of the opposition that the forces of Alexander Luthor and the old Superman were presenting. Fighting while divided was not simply fighting with fewer resources, it was fighting in a state where the coordination that had always been the team's primary advantage was compromised at its source. Batman built a satellite that could track every superhero on Earth. Then Maxwell Lord used it to try to kill them all. Breathe in, feel the air move through you. There is something almost unbearable about the next part of this story, not because of the scale of the catastrophe, though the scale was immense, but because of what it reveals about the particular kind of damage that accumulates in brilliant wounded people who have decided that the only person they can fully trust is themselves. The satellite was called Brother Eye, and it was, in some ways, the most perfect expression of everything that had gone wrong inside the Justice League's most guarded mind. Bruce Wayne had built Brother Eye in the period following the Tower of Babel revelations, the period after Ra's al Ghul had stolen and deployed his contingency plans, after the League had voted to expel him, after the twin shocks of having his most private analytical work weaponized and being held accountable for the weaponization, as though the theft were the same as the intention. He had returned to the League, eventually, because the League needed him, and because he needed the League even if his psychological architecture produced considerable resistance to the acknowledgement of that need. But he had not returned unchanged. He had returned with a project. The project's logic was, again, internally coherent. The Tower of Babel crisis had demonstrated that the contingency plans he'd kept in the Batcave were vulnerable to physical theft. The solution, in the analytical framework that governed everything Bruce built, was redundancy and distance. A system that lived not in a file on a server in a cave beneath a manor house, but in orbit, encrypted, accessible only to him, capable of monitoring the full range of metahuman activity on the planet's surface. The system would do what his contingency files had done, maintain a comprehensive real-time picture of where the League's members were, what they were doing, what their current physiological and psychological status indicated about their reliability, and it would do it from a position that no one could reach without his knowing about it. Brother Eye. An eye that never closed. The construction of Brother Eye was not something Bruce discussed with the League. This was, by now, a characteristic pattern rather than an anomaly. The decisions he made about what to share and what to keep private followed a logic that was consistent enough to constitute a world view. Information shared is information at risk, and risk is something to be minimized wherever the mathematics permitted. He had learned this lesson with a comprehensiveness that his childhood had begun, and his adult life had repeatedly reinforced. The Batcave's secrets were breachable. The League's meetings were not private in the way that truly sensitive operational planning required. Brother Eye would be private in a way that nothing he had ever built had managed to be. Maxwell Lord was another person who had been watching from his own particular vantage point as the League accumulated its internal history. Lord was a human being, not a metahuman, not an alien, not a product of any of the processes that produced the beings he had spent years studying, who had come to the conclusion that the metahuman population represented an existential threat to ordinary humanity that the ordinary mechanisms of governance were not equipped to address. His position was not entirely without logic. The League's internal history, the contingency plans, the memory alterations, the accumulated record of extraordinary beings making unilateral decisions about what ordinary people needed to know or not know about them, was not a history that obviously argued against concern. What Lord had built, in parallel with and in response to his surveillance of the metahuman community, was the OMAC project, a system of nanotechnology capable of converting ordinary human beings into meta-capable soldiers, programmed to identify and neutralize superhumans. The OMACs were not autonomous in the way that truly self-directing systems are autonomous. They required oversight, They required a targeting system capable of tracking metahumans across the full range of their capabilities and locations. They required, in other words, exactly the kind of comprehensive real-time intelligence about the superhero community that Brother Eye provided. The way Lord obtained access to Brother Eye is a story that involves a level of patient, methodical infiltration that represents, in the community of people who had been studying the League from outside it, perhaps the most sophisticated attack the team had ever faced. It was not a frontal assault. It was not a technological override. It was the kind of access that comes from finding the gap between what a system was built to prevent and what its builder believed was safe to leave unguarded. Brother Eye had been built to be inaccessible to anyone but Bruce. It had not been built with sufficient attention to the question of what it looked like from the outside, what it broadcast inadvertently about its own architecture. Lord found the gap and did what patient, intelligent adversaries always eventually do with the gaps they find. Sit with this for a moment. The pattern has repeated now enough times that it deserves to be named directly. Batman built the contingency plans to protect the world from the League, and Ra's al Ghul used them to attack the League. Batman built Brother Eye to watch the metahuman community from a position of safety, and Maxwell Lord used it to launch a coordinated assault on that community. The same mind, the same logic, the same impulse toward unilateral control of information, producing the same outcome twice. A system built from distrust becoming the instrument of the very attack it was designed to prevent. Wonder Woman killed Maxwell Lord. This is the act that stands at the center of the Brother Eye crisis and that radiates outward from it through everything that followed. Lord had gained mental control of Superman, had turned the most powerful being on the planet into a weapon aimed at his teammates, and had demonstrated both the capability and the intention to use that weapon until the damage was complete. Diana had captured Lord and asked him how to free Superman from his control. Lord had told her that the only way to end the control was to end him, and Diana, with the particular quality of pragmatic ruthlessness that her warrior's education had produced alongside her profound ethical framework, had done exactly what Lord had told her was necessary. The act was recorded, the recording circulated, and the world outside the League, the world of ordinary people and journalists and government agencies, and the full range of human institutions that had always maintained an uneasy relationship with the beings who claimed to protect it, processed what it had seen. Wonder Woman, the League's most visible representative of the aspiration toward justice, snapping a man's neck on camera. The complexity of the situation, the mind control, the choices Lord had offered, the calculation that one death now prevented many deaths later, did not survive the transformation into a 30-second clip. What survived was the image. And the image said something about the League that the League's most carefully constructed public architecture had always been designed to prevent anyone from seeing. The modern echo lives in the moment when you recognize that the systems you built to protect yourself have become, in some way you did not intend, the instruments of the harm you were trying to prevent. The League's members, individually and collectively, had built structures designed to manage the risks they saw most clearly. The risks from outside, the risks from powers greater than their own, the risks from the void of space and the depths of other dimensions, the risks from inside, from the accumulation of their own unexamined assumptions and unshared decisions, had been the ones they had not built for, and those were the ones that kept finding ways through. The OMAC technology that Maxwell Lord had developed represented in its functional architecture a kind of dark reflection of the League itself, a system designed to operate at extraordinary capability in service of a protective purpose, built by someone who had decided that the existing structures for managing superhuman power were inadequate, and that the only responsible response was to build something new and better. Lord had not arrived at his position through indifference to the League's achievements. He had studied those achievements carefully, alongside the League's failures and the pattern of decision-making that the failures revealed, and he had concluded, with a certainty that allowed for no further examination, that human beings who could not access superhuman power needed their own mechanism for checking superhuman power. The OMAC project was his version of Batman's contingency plans, scaled up, weaponized and deployed with the specific intent to use them rather than the hope that they would never be needed. The specific individuals who were converted into OMAC units, their identities, their previous lives, the particular losses that their transformation represented, constituted one of the crisis's most quietly devastating dimensions. They were not soldiers who had volunteered. They were ordinary people who had been carrying the nanotechnology without their knowledge, placed in that position by a program that had operated beneath the level of public awareness for years. Their transformation, when it came, was not something they had agreed to or anticipated or could resist. They became weapons in a war they had not known they were enrolled in, wielded by a system that saw them as instruments of a security architecture rather than as people with their own claims on their own existence. The resonance with what the League had done, the memory alterations, the decisions made about other people's minds without those people's consent, was precise and painful. Wonder Woman's confrontation with Maxwell Lord did not end with the action that the recording captured. The moment after, the immediate aftermath, when the threat had been neutralized and the full weight of what had happened arrived, was something that the recording did not show and that Diana did not discuss in the period that followed with any but her closest confidants. She had made the calculation that Lord presented her with complete clarity and no hesitation, because hesitation would have been its own form of choice, and because the calculus, as she processed it, admitted of no other conclusion that she could reach and live with. What she had not fully prepared for in that moment was the distance between the rightness of the decision and the feeling of having made it. Both things were real. They did not resolve each other. The fracture in the League's public standing that followed the Wonder Woman recording was not simply a public relations problem. It was the externalization of a fracture that had been internal for years. The public's response, the fear, the anger, the questioning of whether heroes who made these decisions could be trusted with the power they had been given, mirrored with almost uncomfortable precision the questions that the League's own members had been circling for years, in the privacy of their meetings and their individual reckonings, without arriving at satisfying answers. The recording did not reveal something new about the League. It revealed something that had always been there, in the gap between the image the team projected and the full complexity of how it actually operated. The moment when the Justice League discovered the full scope of the Brother Eye network, not just the system's existence but the depth of the surveillance it had been conducting, the comprehensiveness of the data it had accumulated about each of them over the period of its operation, produced a reaction that was more complex than simple anger. The anger was present, and it was real, and in several of the team's members it was fierce. But beneath the anger was something more disorienting. The recognition that the surveillance had been so thorough and so accurate that in a strange way it felt like being known. The system had been watching them long enough to map their patterns, their habits, their movements and tendencies, and the particular ways each member's behavior expressed their underlying psychology. The anger at the violation competed with the unsettling awareness that what had been violated was intimacy. The institutional aftermath of the OMAC crisis, the formal processes of accountability, inquiry and reorganization that followed the defeat of Maxwell Lord and the shutdown of Brother Eye, consumed more of the League's time and energy than the crisis itself had. This is characteristic of how the League's internal crises tended to work. The acute phase was handled with the speed and efficiency that the team's capabilities made possible, and the chronic phase, the long, slow, unglamorous process of understanding what had happened and why and how to prevent it recurring, demanded a different kind of discipline that the team's training and mythology had not prepared it as well for. Inquiry was not the same as combat. The skills that made you effective in one were not automatically transferable to the other, and the members who were most effective in the acute phase were not always the ones best positioned to do the work that the aftermath required. Barry Allen ran back in time to save his mother. In doing so, he erased the Justice League from existence. Let that be what it is. A man loved his mother. A man had the power to do something about the worst day of his life, the day that had shaped everything about who he became and why he became it, and he used that power with a completeness that asked no one's permission and consulted no one's judgment. The grief of it is genuine. The love behind it is not in question. And the world it produced was almost beyond salvage. The story of Flashpoint is the story of the League's internal unraveling told at its most intimate scale, a single act made from love by the person least likely to be identified as a threat to everything. Sleep research has found, in its patient accumulation of data about what happens to the resting mind, that the brain does not simply switch off during sleep. It reorganizes. It takes the experiences of the day, the decisions made, the emotions felt, the things that did not get processed in the urgency of being awake, and it works through them with a thoroughness that waking attention cannot match. This is part of why difficult things sometimes feel more manageable in the morning than they did the night before. The sleeping mind has been doing work. The story of Flashpoint is a story about what happens when the reorganization goes wrong, when the attempt to process the old wound produces a reality that cannot sustain the people living in it. Nora Allen had been murdered when Barry was a child. The murderer, he learned it eventually in the way that the most important revelations tend to arrive, later than you would have wanted and with implications that require years to fully absorb, was Yobard Thorne, the Reverse Flash, a man from the future who had built his entire psychology around hatred of Barry Allen and who had travelled backward through time to take from Barry the thing that Barry could not afford to lose. The murder had made Barry into the Flash. It had also made him into something else, a man whose relationship to time was inevitably complicated by the knowledge that it was not fixed, that the tragedy at the foundation of his identity had not been inevitable, that it was one outcome among the infinite outcomes that the Speed Force, if accessed with sufficient intention, could theoretically still reach back and change. He had not done it for years. He had understood, in the way that people who carry enormous capability alongside genuine ethical awareness understand these things, that the knowledge of what was possible and the wisdom to refrain from doing it were not the same thing, but that the wisdom mattered. He had run alongside his teammates and faced the things they faced together and carried his grief the way he carried everything, at a pace that exceeded the normal human rate, processed and metabolized through the constant motion that was both his gift and his primary relationship with what it meant to be alive. But grief does not metabolize completely. It settles, it waits, it surfaces at the exact moments when the other conditions, the exhaustion, the accumulated loss, the specific configuration of circumstances that briefly makes the impossible feel like the only available option, combine to produce a decision that the analytical mind, operating under normal conditions, would not make. Barry ran back in time and stopped Thorne before Thorne could kill Nora Allen, and in doing so he changed everything that had ever depended on the fixed fact of that murder. The world that resulted from the alteration was not a better world. It was a world in which Thomas Wayne, Bruce's father, who in the original timeline had died in the alley alongside his wife, had survived the shooting, having thrown himself between the gunman and his family with a desperation that had saved them both and cost him nothing except his son. Bruce had been the one to die that night in the Flashpoint timeline, and Thomas Wayne, carrying a grief that the original Bruce had carried and transformed into something disciplined and directed, had become Batman instead, a darker version, one whose grief had not been metabolized through years of training and ethical development, but had instead calcified into a capacity for violence that made the original Batman look restrained. The Justice League did not exist in the Flashpoint world. Without Bruce Wayne's Batman as its organizing center, without the particular history that had produced each of its members in the specific form they occupied in the original timeline, the team that had stood between the world and its worst possibilities simply was not there. What existed instead was a world at war, an apocalyptic conflict between the Amazons and Atlanteans that was consuming the European continent, a conflict between Diana and Arthur Curry that had none of the qualified alliance of the original timeline, and all of the potential for mutual destruction. Superman existed in this world, but not as the Superman of Kansas fields and adoptive family love. He had been captured as an infant by the government and held in a containment facility his entire life, never having seen the sun, never having touched the earth, never having become the person that the original Clark Kent's human upbringing had made him. Barry Allen spent much of the Flashpoint timeline trying to understand what had happened and how to undo it. The process was complicated by the fact that his own memories were unstable. The alteration he had made had changed the timeline so fundamentally that even his experience of his own past was flickering, threatening to resolve into a version of history that would no longer contain the knowledge of what he had done. He was racing, in the most literal sense, against the dissolution of his own identity. The world he had made was destroying the person who had made it. The restoration of the original timeline came at a cost that Flashpoint made explicit in a way that the League's other crises had not. Thomas Wayne, the Batman of a world that should not have existed, wrote a letter to his son. He had learned from Barry that in the original world Bruce had survived and had become Batman, and had built something from grief that was worth having, a life with meaning and purpose, and the particular form of love that someone like Bruce managed in the ways available to him. Thomas wrote the letter knowing that the restoration of the original timeline would erase the world he occupied, and therefore would erase him. He wrote it anyway. The letter, read by Bruce in the aftermath of the restoration, represented perhaps the single most devastating communication in the League's entire history. A message from the version of his father who had survived, telling the son who had lost him that it was all right, that the grief had been worth it, that he should be happy. The Flashpoint demonstrated, with a completeness that no other crisis had quite managed, the recursive nature of the damage the League had been accumulating. The crises were not separate events connected only by chronology. They were expressions of the same underlying pattern, individuals of extraordinary capability, carrying wounds that their capability could not heal, making decisions from those wounds that operated at a scale proportional to their power. Barry had not intended to create a catastrophe. He had intended to save his mother. The gap between those two things, between the scale of the intention and the scale of the consequence, was the gap that the League had never fully learned to manage, in itself or in its members. The world was restored. Barry remembered what he had done, and in the years that followed, he carried the particular knowledge of someone who has seen exactly what his love looks like when it operates without discipline, the knowledge that the most human impulse, the desire to reach back and fix the unfixable, was in his case capable of ending everything. The Speed Force, as Barry Allen understood it, was not simply a source of power. It was a relationship, a living connection between himself and the fundamental structure of time that had a quality of reciprocity that none of his scientific analyses had ever fully captured. When he ran, he did not simply move through time faster than other beings. He moved in relationship with time, in a way that time registered and responded to. The Speed Force felt what he needed, in some sense that physicists had no vocabulary for. This quality of reciprocity was beautiful when it produced the speed that let him help people. It was devastating when it produced the vulnerability that the Reverse Flash had exploited. The awareness that his love for the speed was also a kind of porousness, an openness to time that, if something he loved was threatened at the temporal level, left him without the emotional defenses that other beings could deploy. The Thomas Wayne of the Flashpoint world was a study in what grief becomes when it is never metabolized through purpose. The original Bruce had transformed his grief into something, a mission, a discipline, a life organized around preventing others from experiencing the loss that had broken him open. The grief was still there, in the Batman that Bruce had become. It never went anywhere, and anyone who knew him well enough could see it in the quality of his attention to vulnerable people, in the particular way he moved toward rather than away from loss. Thomas had not had that transformation available to him. His grief had nowhere to go except inward and downward, had calcified rather than crystallized, had produced a Batman who operated from the same emotional substrate, but without the architectural channeling that had made Bruce's grief generative rather than simply consuming. The question of causality that Flashpoint raised, whether Barry's alteration of the timeline was the primary cause of the Flashpoint world's existence, or whether Thorne's original murder of Nora had introduced the causal violation that Barry was simply responding to, was not resolved cleanly by any of the theoretical frameworks the Flash family had developed for thinking about temporal mechanics. The short answer, which Barry arrived at and lived with, and did not always find sufficient, was that the chain of causation was a loop. Thorne had created the conditions that made Barry's intervention feel necessary, and Barry's intervention had created the conditions that made the Flashpoint world possible, and the attempt to restore the original timeline had introduced the new 52 alterations that ensured neither the original timeline nor the Flashpoint world was exactly what either of them would have chosen. Causation at the temporal level was not a simple arrow pointing from cause to effect, it was a braid. The letter that Thomas Wayne wrote to Bruce was not the last thing Thomas did in the Flashpoint world. He also fought with the particular ferocity of someone who had nothing to protect anymore, except the possibility that the sacrifice he was making would mean something to someone he would never meet. He fought alongside Barry against threats that the Flashpoint world had generated from the energies of its own instability, and he fought well, with the competence of someone who had been Batman long enough to know how. The fighting was, in some sense, his final gift, not to Bruce, who was not there to see it, but to the principle that had always connected them across the temporal divide. The principle that said, even when everything is lost, you keep trying, because the trying is not separate from who you are, it is the expression of who you are. The New 52 world that emerged from the resolution of Flashpoint was not simply the original universe restored, it was a different configuration, one in which the histories of the heroes were subtly, but significantly altered, in which relationships that had developed over decades were compressed or rearranged or in some cases had not yet occurred at all. Superman and Lois Lane were not yet together. Batman had a different relationship to his extended family. The League itself had a shorter shared history and therefore thinner trust reserves than the team that had faced the crises that preceded the Flashpoint reset. The new universe had, in other words, been handed the same structural challenges that the old one had struggled with, equipped with less of the accumulated relational capital that the old universe had spent decades building. The pattern would express itself again. The only question was which expression it would choose first. In one possible future, Superman built a prison inside the sun for anyone who disagreed with him. The Justice League helped him do it. The room around you is very quiet now. The air carries the particular texture of deep night, the hour when the day's residue is finally settled and the mind begins to release its grip on the things it held most tightly. Let your breathing slow. Let the next chapter arrive at the pace it requires. What follows is perhaps the most difficult passage in the League's internal history, not because of the scale of the catastrophe, though the scale was immense, but because the person at the centre of it was the one who was supposed to be the best of them, the one who was supposed to prove that power and goodness could coexist without compromise. The Joker tricked Superman into killing Lois Lane. The specifics involve a fear toxin and a nuclear device, and a chain of events designed by someone who had spent decades studying the one vulnerability that the most powerful being on the planet actually possessed. Clark Kent's strength came from the sun. His speed came from his Kryptonian biology. His invulnerability came from the particular way his cells processed solar radiation. None of these things, not the strength, not the speed, not the invulnerability, protected him from love. The Joker had understood this for years and had been patient. Lois Lane died. The child she was carrying died with her. Metropolis was destroyed by the nuclear device that her death triggered, and Superman, Kal-El, Clark Kent, the last son of Krypton who had made a farm in Kansas his spiritual home and had chosen, for decades, to operate within the constraints of human law and human judgment, because he believed that those constraints were not limitations on goodness, but expressions of it, went to find the Joker. What happened when he found him is not something that requires extended description. It is enough to say that the Joker, who had survived everything for decades through a combination of legal technicality and narrative immunity, did not survive this. The act was not, from Superman's perspective in the immediate aftermath, a crossing of a line. It was the crossing of every line simultaneously. The decision to stop making the distinction between what he was capable of doing and what he had permitted himself to do, a distinction that had been the primary operating principle of his heroic career. The distinction had cost him things over the years. It had cost him Lois, in the final accounting, because the constraints he operated within had left enough room for the Joker to work in. He had held the line, and the line had not held Lois. The logic of abandoning the line in the immediate devastation of that conclusion had a brutal coherence. Batman refused to accept it. This refusal was the first fracture in a community of heroes that would eventually divide into a war. Bruce's position was not, as Superman's grief state characterized it, indifference to Lois or to Clark's pain. His position was the one he had always held, expressed now with the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake, in a way that Clark, in the dimensions of his grief, could not currently access. That the moment you permit yourself to cross the line that separates you from the things you fight, the line disappears. Not for that moment, not for that situation, not for the particular circumstances that seem to justify the exception. It disappears, and without it, you're no longer what you claimed to be when people chose to trust you. Superman had always believed at some level that Bruce's position on this question was a kind of emotional deficit, a failure to feel the full weight of the loss that kept Bruce in an artificial relationship to the moral stakes. What the Injustice world revealed was something more uncomfortable. that Bruce's position was not the product of insufficient feeling, but of a quality of discipline that had been built specifically to survive the moments when feeling was strongest. The line held not because you didn't feel the grief or the rage, but because you had decided in advance and with full awareness of what it would cost that feeling would not be the last word. The regime that Superman built in the aftermath of Lois's death did not arrive complete and tyrannical in a single moment. This is the part of the injustice story that is most worth sitting with, because it is the part that most closely mirrors the processes that the League's internal history had already been demonstrating. The incremental drift, the sequence of individually justifiable decisions that together produce an outcome that no single decision would have produced alone. Superman did not decide to become a dictator. He decided that the Joker had to die. Then he decided that crime had to stop, not be managed but stopped, through the application of force sufficient to make it stop. Then he decided that governments unwilling to cooperate with this project were obstacles rather than legitimate authorities. Then he decided that the heroes who refused to participate were opponents. Each step followed from the previous one with a logic that was, from inside the sequence, difficult to argue with. The League that formed around him in the Injustice timeline was the League's most troubling mirror. These were not villains, they were heroes, people who had spent their careers defined by genuine courage and genuine ethical commitment, who had watched the same events as Bruce and had arrived at different conclusions about what those events required. Diana concluded that a world without war was worth the cost of a king. Hal Jordan concluded that order was more important than the process by which it was achieved. The Flash concluded, painfully and with visible reluctance, that standing against Superman was a losing position that would produce more harm than standing with him. One by one, the team that had been built on the principle of accountability made peace with the absence of it. Sit with this. The Injustice world is not an alternate universe interesting for its dramatic divergences. It is a cautionary mirror held up to the exact tendencies that the League's actual history had been displaying in smaller increments for years. The Tower of Babel protocols were Batman deciding that his judgment about what might be necessary took precedence over the team's right to know what he was building. The Identity Crisis memory alterations were a group deciding that their judgment about what was safe to know took precedence over the individual's right to their own unmodified memory. The Injustice regime was Superman deciding that his judgment about what the world needed took precedence over the world's right to decide for itself. The scale changed. The mechanism was identical. Bruce fought the regime. He fought it with the particular tenacity of someone who had spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this, the moment when the most powerful beings in the world stopped being on the same side as the people they were supposed to protect. He had built his contingency plans for this. He had trained for this. He had maintained, through everything the League's internal history had put him through, the conviction that the line between power and accountability was worth defending, even when defending it cost everything. The modern echoes the question this part of the story leaves in the air. It is the question of what you do when the person you trusted most, the person whose goodness seemed most fundamental, most reliable, most immune to the corruptions that touched everyone else, crosses the line you believed they would never cross. The League had built its entire architecture on the conviction that Superman's goodness was the anchor. When the anchor moved, everything that had been attached to it moved with it. The period between the Joker's scheme and Superman's decision to end the Joker's life was brief in calendar time and immeasurable in its internal experience. Clark Kent in those hours existed in a state that his Kryptonian physiology was not designed to manage, a grief so complete that the solar energy his cells were continuously absorbing seemed almost cruel in its contrast to the cold inside him. He was the most powerful being on the planet, and the most powerful being on the planet was lying on the floor of a devastated city, holding something that no amount of power could change. The decision that formed in those hours was not the product of a moment's rage. It was the product of a sustained, clear-eyed confrontation with the arithmetic of loss, the recognition that the Joker, left alive, represented the continued possibility of loss at this scale, and that the only mechanism for preventing that continued possibility that was not subject to the failures and loopholes that the legal system had always provided was the mechanism he had always refused to use. Hal Jordan's trajectory in the Injustice world reflected a kind of moral exhaustion that his previous history had been building toward without quite reaching. He was not a villain. He had spent his career defined by genuine courage and a relationship to willpower that went deeper than the functional capacity the ring required. It was a philosophical commitment, a belief that the self's capacity to choose and act was the most fundamental thing a person had. In a world where Superman was making choices at the level of global governance, Hal's own will had been placed in a position where the only available expressions of it were either compliance with a power too great to effectively oppose, or resistance to a power too great to effectively oppose. The choice to comply was not made from weakness. It was made from the particular kind of pragmatic reasoning that people with genuine capability often produce when they are trying to manage their complicity in something they have not fully accepted. The Batman of the Injustice world operated with resources that were, in some important ways, the inverse of what he was used to. He had always worked in the shadows of a world where the law was nominally in force, and where his extra-legal operations were managed in tension with that nominal force. In the Injustice world, he was the Resistance, the faction opposing the established order, which happened to be an established order controlled by beings of far greater physical capability than anything he had previously operated against. The irony of his position, that the contingency plans he had built for managing the League's power were now the foundation of the strategy for opposing the League's power, was not lost on him. He had been right about the need for those plans in a way that the League's earlier repudiation of them had felt like a refusal to acknowledge. He had been right, and the world in which he was proven right was a world he would have given everything to prevent. Lex Luthor's role in the Injustice narrative deserves more careful examination than the simplified version of his character typically receives. In the main timeline's Injustice world, Luthor maintained a position of observation and analysis, watching the Superman regime develop with the particular quality of attention of someone who had spent decades studying Kal-El and who could see, in the trajectory of the regime's development, the specific ways in which the unlimited power he had always argued was dangerous was becoming exactly as dangerous as he had always argued. His hatred of Superman had always contained within it an argument that the world could not safely contain a being of this capability without the mechanisms of accountability that Superman's mythology had always resisted. The Injustice world was, from Lex's perspective, the proof. He did not feel vindicated. He felt implicated in the way that anyone who predicted a catastrophe and failed to prevent it eventually feels implicated in the catastrophe's occurrence. The question that the Injustice world poses, and that the story refuses to answer neatly because the question does not have a neat answer, is not whether Superman was right or wrong to do what he did. The question is whether the League's architecture had ever been adequate to prevent it. If the same person, with the same wounds and the same capabilities, had been operating inside a team with genuine accountability structures that were not aspirational but functional, that were maintained not through individual virtue but through institutional design, would the outcome have been the same? The Injustice world did not happen because Superman was secretly worse than he appeared. It happened because the things that made him who he was at his best were also, under specific conditions that the League's existing structure was not equipped to prevent, the things that could make him something else. When the universe was rewritten, the Justice League was given a chance to start over. They used it to make the same mistakes faster. There is something almost comforting about that if you let yourself receive it at the right angle. Not the mistakes themselves, the mistakes were real and had real consequences, but the fact that the impulses behind them were not products of that particular history, that particular sequence of crises and revelations and accumulated damage. They were something more fundamental. They were the natural consequence of what happens when beings of extraordinary capability try to organize themselves around principles of accountability that their capability simultaneously makes difficult to enforce. The New 52 universe, rebuilt from its Flashpoint dissolution into a sharper and more contemporary configuration, demonstrated this with the efficiency of a controlled experiment. Let your body settle a little further into its rest. The next part of this story is quieter in some ways, not the dramatic collapses of the earlier chapters, but the slower, more pervasive damage that comes from patterns reasserting themselves in new soil. Sometimes the most instructive thing about a failure is not the dramatic moment of collapse, but the long, ordinary period before it, when everything looks fine and the same seeds are quietly taking root. The New 52 Justice League was assembled in the context of an early invasion. Darkseid, the Lord of Apocalypse, dispatching his forces as a preliminary to his own arrival. The team that formed to face this threat was assembled quickly, under pressure, without the slow accretion of shared history that the original League had built over years of working together. They were thrown together by necessity, and held together by the fact that the necessity did not immediately relent. The bonds formed under this kind of pressure are real, but different from the bonds formed in the quieter spaces between crises. More intense in some ways, more brittle in others, rooted in the heat of shared emergency rather than in the accumulated texture of shared ordinary life. The problems began, as the League's problems always began, in the space between what was said in the group and what was kept private. The new configuration of the team included members whose relationship to each other was newer, whose trust had less history to draw on, and whose individual commitments to transparency were tested sooner and in more unforgiving circumstances. The particular tension between Batman and Superman, a tension that the original League had spent years managing without resolving, reasserted itself almost immediately in the new universe, expressing itself in the same underlying disagreement about information and control that had defined it in the original timeline. The secret societies that formed in the margins of the League's official operations were perhaps the clearest sign that the new universe had inherited the old universe's most fundamental dynamic. The Justice League of America, assembled by the government as a response to the perceived unaccountability of the main League, introduced a formal institutional suspicion into the superhero ecosystem that mirrored, at the level of official policy, the suspicion that individual League members had always carried unofficially. The message was explicit in ways that the original Tower of Babel had been implicit. The League was not trusted, and the response to not being trusted was to create a parallel structure designed to check it. The Trinity War that developed from this configuration demonstrated something that the earlier crises had suggested, but not proven with such direct clarity, that the division of the superhero community into competing groups that suspected and monitored each other created vulnerabilities that neither group could individually close. The Crime Syndicate's invasion, the arrival of the evil mirror versions of the Justice League from Earth 3, the same Earth that had produced Alexander Luthor, exploited exactly the fractures that the League's division had created. The invasion did not have to defeat the League. It had to find the gaps between the factions that the League's own organisational choices had opened, and it found them with an efficiency that suggested the gaps had been anticipated. The Crime Syndicate was, in a particular sense, the most honest mirror the League had ever faced. Where the injustice world had shown what the League's members might become if grief and power combined without constraint, the Syndicate showed what the League's structure looked like when the pretense of principle was stripped away, and only the mechanics remained. The Syndicate operated on the logic that had always been present, in latent form, in the League's actual behaviour. That exceptional capability justifies exceptional authority, that the strongest will and should govern, but operated on it without the ethical overlay that the League's members maintained. The horror of the Syndicate was not that they were so different, it was that they were a recognisable extrapolation. The forever evil event that followed the Syndicate's invasion required, for its resolution, the cooperation of the villains, specifically the cooperation of Lex Luthor, who had decided that whatever the Justice League's failures had been, an Earth governed by the Syndicate was worse than an Earth governed by the imperfect mechanisms of superhuman accountability that the League represented. Luthor's participation in the League's salvation was itself a kind of commentary on the state the League had reached. That the team built to represent humanity's highest aspirations required the assistance of humanity's most infamous criminal to survive its own worst crisis. Lex Luthor was subsequently admitted to the Justice League. This decision, made under pressure, made in recognition of what his capabilities had contributed, made with the awareness that refusing him was both politically unworkable and strategically unwise, was the New 52's most compressed version of all the earlier crises combined. A team that had demonstrated across decades of internal history its struggle to maintain accountability and transparency in its own membership, admitting the man whose life's work had been the application of extraordinary intelligence to the accumulation of power, and hoping that the structures that had failed to contain the League's own members' worst impulses would somehow contain his. The structure held, for a while, in the way that structures do when the immediate pressures that produce the decision have not yet been replaced by the slower pressures that the decision creates. Luthor in the League was not immediately catastrophic. It was instead a slow recalibration of what the League meant, what it was willing to include, what its principles actually required of its members, whether the line between hero and something else was drawn, whether the League had always claimed it was drawn, or whether it had always been drawn at a slightly different place that the rhetoric of heroism had obscured. The lesson of the New 52, held alongside all the earlier crises, is not that the League failed again in ways that could have been avoided with better judgment. The lesson is that the failures were not primarily about judgment. They were about structure, about the fundamental difficulty of building accountable institutions from individuals whose capability exceeds the capacity of any institution to contain them. Every version of the League encountered this difficulty. Every version made some version of the same choices in response to it. The universe could be rebuilt. The pattern rebuilt itself alongside it. The establishment of the Justice League of America, the government-sponsored team assembled as a counterweight to the main League, introduced into the superhero ecosystem a dynamic that had previously been implicit in the relationship between the League and the institutions of government, but had never been so formally structured. The JLA was not simply a rival team. It was an institutional expression of distrust, a declaration that the main League's claims to act in the public interest required checking by a body with different membership and different accountability structures. The members recruited for the JLA were chosen, in part, for their anticipated willingness to act against the main League if circumstances required it, which meant that the team's composition was shaped from the beginning by the question of who would be willing to fight the people they had previously stood alongside. Steve Trevor, who was involved in the formation of the JLA, occupied a particularly complicated position in the architecture of institutional suspicion that the New 52 had built. His history with Diana, the relationship that had defined a chapter of both their lives and that had ended with the complexity that endings of that particular intensity tend to produce, meant that his involvement in a project designed to check the League was not simply a professional assignment. It carried a personal dimension that professional frameworks were not designed to contain. He was in some ways the most human element in a story that tended to operate at scales that made ordinary human experience hard to maintain visibility of, a person whose history with the League's founding members was not analytical or institutional but intimate, and who had to find a way to operate from that intimacy within a structure designed to treat the League's members as potential threats. The secret society of supervillains, which formed in the same period as the institutional tensions between the League factions, represented the logical external response to the superhero community's internal division. When a community that has previously maintained a unified front develops visible fractures, the fractures are read by those who oppose the community as opportunities. The villains who assembled into the secret society were not making a new calculation. They were responding to information that the League's public behavior had made available, the information that the team was divided, that its members were operating in mutual suspicion rather than unified purpose, and that the coordination that had previously made the League so difficult to effectively oppose was significantly degraded. The Trinity War's central mystery, the question of who had killed Dr. Light and how, was constructed as a whodunit but functioned, narratively, as a mirror. The investigation that the three Justice League factions conducted simultaneously, in competition and in occasional coordination, produced less information about the specific incident than it produced about the assumptions each faction was operating from. Each group read the available evidence through the framework of their existing suspicions, which meant that the investigation produced conclusions that confirmed those suspicions rather than transcending them. This is, as it happens, exactly how investigations work when the investigators have strong prior beliefs about what they will find. Not through dishonesty, but through the ordinary operation of minds that have already organized the relevant information according to a pre-existing theory. The period following the Forever Evil event, in which the main League had been incapacitated and Lex Luthor had led the villains who saved the world, produced an institutional reckoning that the team found genuinely difficult to manage. The reckoning was not primarily about whether Luthor deserved credit, the evidence was not in dispute, but about what the event said about the League's actual position in the world's protective architecture. The League had built its identity, in part, on the premise that it was necessary, that the world could not adequately protect itself without the specific capabilities and the specific relationships among those capabilities that the League provided. The Forever Evil event had demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, that the world could be saved in the League's absence by a group of individuals who had spent their careers as the League's opponents. The premise of necessity had been tested and found more contingent than the League's self-conception had allowed. The broader question of the New 52 universe's relationship to the histories that had preceded it, the question of what was remembered, what was changed, what had been preserved across the temporal disruption of Flashpoint's resolution, haunted the team in ways that were difficult to fully articulate because they were difficult to fully verify. Members compared notes, occasionally, about the details of their shared history that seemed different, about the specific events that appeared to have resolved differently in the new timeline without clear explanation. The conversations were uncertain in a way that conversations grounded in shared experience are not usually uncertain, because the shared experience was itself in question. The League had always been a team in part because of its history, the things they had been through together, the specific texture of the relationship built across specific events. In the New 52, the history was partially legible and partially not, and the team built from it was correspondingly solid in some places and uncertain in others. The inclusion of Lex Luthor in the Justice League was not the first time the team had recruited someone whose history gave reasonable grounds for concern about their reliability as a partner in the project of protecting the world. The League's roster had always included members whose relationship to conventional heroic morality was complicated, members who had operated on the margins of legality, who had made choices in their pasts that their present commitments required them to acknowledge and account for, who were in the League precisely because the League had decided that capability and commitment to the work mattered more than clean hands. Luthor's inclusion was different not in kind but in degree, in the specific quality and extent of his previous choices, in the precision with which his intelligence had historically been deployed against the team's interests, and in the very particular way that his presence in the League changed the League's meaning, both to its members and to the world observing them. During the Darkseid War, the Justice League members became gods. Every single one of them immediately became a danger to the people they were trying to protect. The night is very deep now. You have travelled a long distance through this story, through all the ways that the League's internal fractures expressed themselves across the full span of its history, and what you have arrived at here is the chapter that makes the pattern most explicit. What happens when the barriers between extraordinary capability and ordinary accountability are not just strained but dissolved? What happens when the beings who had been operating just below the threshold of godhood for years cross it entirely and discover what lies on the other side? The Darkseid War was the collision of two cosmic forces, Darkseid, the Lord of Apocalypse, whose obsession with the anti-life equation represented perhaps the most philosophically coherent form of nihilism in the DC cosmos, and the Anti-Monitor, the entity whose previous conflict had collapsed the multiverse in the original Crisis. The Justice League was not a primary actor in this conflict. It was terrain. It was the collateral location through which two beings of effectively incomprehensible power were moving, and the question of whether the League could survive being between them was genuinely open. The members of the League were changed by the war's energies in ways that were immediate and enormous. Superman was exposed to the Mobius chair, the god engine of Metron, and to the fire pits of Apocalypse, and the combination transformed him into something that could barely remember why it had ever constrained itself to human-scale concerns. Batman sat in the Mobius chair itself and gained access to the totality of universal knowledge, every answer to every question, available instantly, completely, without the filtering process that human cognition uses to make knowledge bearable. Hal Jordan was possessed by the Anti-Monitor's power to a degree that made his previous experiences with the darkness of his own psychology look like preliminary sketches. Shazam gained divine fire of a completeness that threatened to consume the humanity that had always been the anchor of his power's use. The transformation of each member produced a version of that member that was recognizable in outline and altered in the most important ways. They still cared about the things they had always cared about: justice, protection, the particular beings whose well-being they had organized their lives around. But caring, at the scale of divine power unconstrained by human accountability, looks different from caring at the scale of a person who is subject to the consequences of the care they provide. The Superman who burned through the Apocalypse fire pits was not indifferent to harm. He simply could not feel the proportionality that had always regulated how his power expressed itself. The Batman who sat in the Mobius chair did not lose his ethical commitments. He simply gained access to so much knowledge simultaneously that the normal human process of weighing competing considerations, the process that produces wisdom rather than mere intelligence, was overwhelmed by the volume of what he now knew. What the Darkseid War revealed in its most concentrated form was the thing that all of the League's previous crises had been approaching from different angles. The danger of the League's members was never primarily external. The cosmic entities and dimensional invasions and villains of extraordinary capability had all been threats that the League was designed to face. The threat that the League had never been designed to face, the threat that kept expressing itself in every chapter of its internal history, was the members themselves, specifically the gap between their capability and their fallibility, the fact that they were beings of nearly limitless power who were also human, or human adjacent, or shaped by human experience in ways that meant they carried human wounds and human blind spots, alongside the inhuman capacities. The resolution of the Darkseid War involved the death of Darkseid, finally, definitively, in a way that the earlier iterations of his defeat had not managed, and the consequent fracturing of his essence into divided aspects that were distributed across the DC cosmos in ways that created new problems for the years following the war. The League survived. The members were returned, with varying degrees of smoothness, to something closer to their previous configurations. The divine fire was contained, the Mobius chair was vacated. The knowledge that Batman had briefly possessed was not, unfortunately, something that could be unknown. He retained fragments of it, specific answers to specific questions that had arrived complete and unbidden in the moment of connection, and he carried those fragments afterward with the particular discomfort of someone who has been told things they had not thought to ask. The question that Batman had asked the Mobius chair in the first moments of his possession of universal knowledge was the identity of the Joker. The chair's answer had not been what any of the histories or theories or analyses of the Joker's origins had produced. The answer had been that there were 3 Jokers. The implication that the person Batman had organised so much of his career around opposing, the presence that had shaped his psychology and his methods and his understanding of what chaos was and why order mattered, was not a single individual but something more complex, a distributed phenomenon whose full nature Bruce had spent years unable to discuss with anyone, was perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of the League's internal experience that the Darkseid War produced. The truth, when finally accessed, created more questions than it answered, and the person who received it was left carrying it alone. The League that emerged from the Darkseid War was older, in a way that was not simply chronological. It had looked at what happened when its members' power expanded beyond the frame that accountability provided, and it had seen that the result was not liberation, but a kind of terrible clarity, the clarity of beings whose capability so exceeded the social structures designed to contain it that the structures themselves became irrelevant. The members had returned from that clarity to the constraints of their ordinary heroic identities, not because the constraints were physically necessary, but because they had seen, in the brief window of their transformation, what operating without constraints actually felt like. And what it felt like was not freedom. It felt like loss. The loss of the particular quality of personhood that only exists in relationship with other people, in the texture of being accountable to something outside yourself. This is the philosophical centre of everything the League had been learning, across all the crises, all the secrets, all the fractures. The accountability was not the limitation of their power. It was the thing that gave the power meaning. The Tower of Babel plans had seemed like prudent preparation until they became the instrument of attack. The memory alterations had seemed like necessary protection until they became the expression of unchecked authority. The surveillance of Brother Eye had seemed like reasonable security until it became the mechanism of betrayal. In every case, the removal of accountability, the decision that this situation, this capability, this judgment was exempt from the normal obligations of transparency and consent, had been the first step toward the harm that followed. Rest in that. Let it settle into the quiet of the night. What the League had been learning across every version of itself and every crisis that had tested it was the same thing. Not that they were bad, not that their enemies were right, but that the line between the best version of themselves and the most dangerous was thinner than their mythology had allowed, and that the only thing that reliably held that line was the choice, made continuously and at real cost, to remain answerable. The anti-life equation, Darkseid's obsession, the thing he had pursued across centuries and civilizations, was not, at the level of its fundamental nature, a weapon. This is the detail that the framing of it as a cosmic threat sometimes obscures. It was a proof. A mathematical demonstration, if you chose to credit mathematics with that kind of reach into philosophical territory, that free will was an illusion, that the choices beings believed they were making were determined by factors outside their control, that the subjective experience of agency was a narrative imposed on a process that had no room for genuine choice. The equation did not destroy life. It persuaded life, at the deepest neurological level, that there was no point in trying. The victims did not cease to exist. They ceased to want. The distinction, for anyone who has lived in the specific despair of not wanting, is recognizable. Metron's Mobius chair was a different kind of omniscience from the kind that Superman's various solar-enhanced states had occasionally produced. It was not the omniscience of sensation, the ability to perceive everything simultaneously, to hear every heartbeat, to see every event, but the omniscience of understanding. The chair knew not just what was happening, but what it meant, not just the events, but the structures beneath the events, the patterns that the events expressed. Sitting in the chair was not like reading an encyclopedia. It was like becoming, briefly, the kind of being for whom the universe is not a collection of separate things, but a single object whose parts are all legible simultaneously. The experience of returning from that to ordinary human cognition, even to the extraordinary cognition of Bruce Wayne, was a loss of a specific kind, the loss of the moment when everything made sense, followed by the return to a world in which most things most of the time remain mysterious. The three Jokers, the revelation that the Mobius chair produced in response to Batman's question, the answer that the chair delivered with the same equanimity it delivered all answers, were not three separate people who had independently chosen the same persona, or three iterations of a single person created by temporal anomaly, or three aspects of a divided psychological entity. The truth was more uncomfortable and more specific than any of those framings, and it was a truth that Bruce sat with in the years following the Darkseid War, in the quiet spaces between crises, allowing it to do whatever it was going to do to the architecture of his understanding. The Joker had been, for decades, the figure around whom Batman's entire philosophical project organized itself, the argument, made flesh, for why the line between order and chaos had to be maintained, why the rules he had made for himself were not simply preferences but necessities, why the cost of mercy was sometimes a cost too great. To discover that this figure was not what he had believed it was not even singular in the way he had believed, was to discover that the organizing principle of his philosophy had been responding to something more complicated than the philosophy had room to accommodate. The Darkseid War produced in its immediate aftermath a renegotiation of what the League understood itself to be, not a deliberate, structured renegotiation, the kind that would have required exactly the kind of transparent collective deliberation that the League had historically struggled to achieve, but the organic, slower renegotiation that happens when people who have been through something together return from it changed and try to find the new terms of their relationship to each other and to the work. Each member returned carrying something different. Each return was a negotiation between the person who had left and the person who had come back. The team that assembled in the war's aftermath was not the team that had entered it, and the work of becoming a team again, rather than a collection of individuals who shared a watchtower and a history, was not something that any of the crises had provided a good model for. The specific knowledge that Bruce retained from the Mobius chair's answer about the Joker, the fact of three, and what that fact implied about the history he thought he knew, was not something he discussed with the team in any systematic way. He mentioned it to certain members in the way that someone mentions a thing they are still processing rather than a thing they have integrated, incompletely, with more questions than answers, with a specific quality of uncertainty that attaches to knowledge that disrupts an organizing framework rather than confirming one. The team received this information with the same uncertain quality with which it was offered, which meant that it remained, in the League's collective awareness, a fact without a clear place in the story, present, acknowledged, and not yet absorbed. The Justice League never solved the problem at its centre. It simply kept choosing again and again to remain together despite it. That choice, made imperfectly and at continuous cost, was what made it what it was. You have come a long way through this story. The night is at its deepest point now, the hour when the distinction between waking and sleeping begins to soften, when the mind starts to release its grip on the day's requirements and the body begins the long, slow work of restoration that sleep makes possible. There is nothing more you need to hold on to. The story has said what it came to say, and what remains is simply the quiet, the particular silence that follows something that was worth paying attention to. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the weight of the night settle around you like something warm. The Justice League's history, held whole and examined without the distortion that comes from only looking at the victories, is a history of brilliant and wounded people trying to do something that may not be entirely possible, to organize extraordinary power around ordinary accountability, to build a team from individuals whose capability exceeds any system designed to check it, and to hold that team together through the continuous discovery of how much they had each, individually and collectively, gotten wrong. The Tower of Babel, the Identity Crisis, the Infinite Crisis, Flashpoint, the Injustice World, Brother Eye, the New 52's recycled fractures, the Darkseid War and its divine transformations, each crisis different in its mechanics, each crisis rooted in the same fundamental tension. What is remarkable, and this is the thing that the dramatic register of superhero narratives sometimes obscures, is that the League kept returning. Batman, expelled for the contingency plans, eventually came back. The members whose memories had been altered continued to work alongside the people who had altered them, finding new terms for a trust that had been revised but not extinguished. The divisions of the Infinite Crisis were repaired imperfectly in the years that followed. The Injustice World remained a world apart, a cautionary territory rather than the final destination. The League that emerged from each crisis was not the same League that had entered it, but it was still a League. The choice to remain together, imperfect and damaged and still trying, was made again after each collapse. The reason this matters, the reason the Justice League's internal history is worth sitting with at this hour in the quiet that sleep approaches, is that it is, at the scale of myth, a story about something very ordinary. It is the story of what happens when people who care about each other, who are trying to do good things together, discover how much damage their own blind spots can produce. The League's blind spots were calibrated to the scale of their power. Ours are calibrated to the scale of ours. The mechanism is the same. The discovery that we have been making decisions from assumptions we did not examine, from wounds we did not acknowledge, from a conviction about our own judgment that our actual record does not entirely support. The discovery is not unique to beings who can shatter mountains. It is available to anyone paying close enough attention. Superman's goodness was real. His fall in the Injustice World did not retroactively make it false. It revealed that goodness without accountability is not as stable as it appears, that the ethical commitments we believe are fundamental to who we are can, under sufficient pressure, become the vocabulary in which we justify the opposite of what we committed to. This is not a reason to distrust goodness. It is a reason to build structures around it that do not depend on it remaining unchallenged. The League understood this periodically and imperfectly. When it remembered, it functioned as well as anything that extraordinary had ever functioned. When it forgot, it became the most dangerous thing in the world. Batman's vigilance was necessary. His refusal to trust completely, the contingency plans, the surveillance, the careful architecture of fallback positions maintained against the possibility that everything he relied on might one day fail, was not simply paranoia. It was the appropriate response of someone who had understood very young that the world did not automatically protect the people in it, and that the only reliable safety was the safety you built yourself. The tragedy of Bruce's position was not that he was wrong about the necessity of vigilance. It was that he could not find a way to be both vigilant and trusting simultaneously. That the architecture he had built to manage uncertainty kept producing as a byproduct the very betrayals that confirmed the need for the architecture. Diana's warrior clarity was genuine and often right. Her willingness to make the hard decision, to accept that some situations have no clean resolution, and that choosing the lesser harm is still a choice that requires courage and responsibility, was a quality the League needed and often lacked. The killing of Maxwell Lord was not simple. It was the kind of decision that only a mind capable of genuine moral seriousness could make, because only such a mind could understand the full weight of what it was deciding. The cost was not that she was wrong. The cost was that the world could not hold the complexity of what she had done, and the simplification of it into something easier to condemn was its own kind of violence. The Flash's love, for his mother, for the life he'd lost before he became what he became, for the ordinary human texture of existence that his extraordinary speed sometimes made it hard to fully inhabit, was the most relatable wound in the League's entire history. It was the wound that anyone who has ever lost something irreplaceable and wondered what it would mean to get it back can recognise without any reference to superpowers. Barry Allen's catastrophe was the catastrophe of caring too much, of acting from the deepest place in himself without asking what the action would produce in the world beyond his own grief. The answer that Flashpoint provided was not a condemnation of the love. It was an answer about what love, operating without wisdom, costs. The world around you is very still. Your body is heavier than it was when this story began. The breath that moves through you carries something quieter now, something that is nearly the rhythm of sleep, the long, even cadence that the body finds when the day's held tension has finally released into the simple fact of rest. There is nothing more required of you tonight. The League's story has no final resolution that provides the clean satisfaction of problems solved and lessons fully learned. It has something better, the evidence that even the most capable beings, in the most extraordinary circumstances, were still trying, still choosing to return, still making the particular form of faith that is not certainty but persistence. The faith that says, we have been wrong before and we will be wrong again and we are still going to try. Let the trying be the last thing you carry into sleep, not the failures, not the betrayals, not the crises that required more from the League than it could cleanly provide. The trying, the returning, the choice, made again and again in the ruins of whatever the last collapse had produced, to rebuild on ground that was never as solid as they hoped, and to keep building anyway. The night is soft around you, the dark is kind. Whatever you are carrying from your own day, your own imperfect attempts, your own moments of failing the standard you set for yourself, let it rest here, alongside the League's history, in the large and patient dark. Sleep well. And if this story moved something in you, if it left you thinking about the space between capability and accountability, between power and the wisdom to carry it gently, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like this channel to explore next, leave it in the comments. The next story is already waiting. The version of the Justice League that exists at any given moment is not a fixed thing. This is perhaps the most important structural fact about the team, and also the one most consistently obscured by the mythological weight that the name carries. The League has been dissolved and reformed, fractured and reunited, reconstituted with different rosters and different philosophical emphases, so many times across its history that the question of which version represents the real League is less useful than the question of what has remained consistent across all the versions. What has remained consistent is not the membership, not the watchtower, not any particular set of operational protocols. What has remained consistent is the aspiration, the particular quality of intention that says, this world is worth protecting, and protecting it is worth the cost, and the cost includes being accountable to each other and to the people you are trying to protect. The relationship between Batman and Superman, the central tension around which so much of the League's internal history organized itself, was not simply the relationship between two people with different methods. It was the relationship between two different theories of what heroism requires. Superman's theory held that the fundamental commitment was to be genuinely good, to act from genuine values, to let the quality of the character do the work of ensuring that the quality of the action followed. Batman's theory held that the fundamental commitment was to be structurally accountable, to build systems that would constrain behavior regardless of the character of the person operating within them, because character was not reliable and systems were more durable. Neither theory was wrong, neither theory was sufficient alone. The League, at its best, was the institution that held both of them in productive tension. The League, at its worst, was the institution in which neither theory was fully applying, and the gap between them was filling with exactly the kind of unexamined decision-making that both theories, in their different ways, were designed to prevent. The ordinary people of the DC universe, Lois Lane, Perry White, Commissioner Gordon, the residents of Metropolis and Gotham, and the cities the League moved through on its way to the next crisis, were not simply backdrop. They were the point. Every decision the League made, whether the decision was made transparently or secretly, whether it was made with the full team's knowledge or in the private chambers of one member's judgment, was made in relationship to these people. their safety, their welfare, their right to know the truth about the beings who claim to protect them. The League's most consistent failure was the failure to treat that relationship as reciprocal, the failure to recognize that protecting people required being honest with them, that the paternalism of deciding what people needed to know was not a form of protection, but a form of control, and that the most powerful version of the League was not the most capable one, but the most trustworthy one. There is a specific quality that comes over the body in the deepest moments of the night, a quality of heaviness that is not burden but ballast, a settling that is not defeat but rest. Your body knows this quality. It has been moving toward it since you began to slow. The breath that carries you now is easy and even and unhurried, the breath of someone who has given the day its full attention and is ready, now, to release it. The story of the Justice League has been, in the end, a story about what it means to remain together through the discovery of your own fallibility, to keep choosing the relationship even after the relationship has revealed how thoroughly it can fail you, because the alternative to the imperfect relationship is not the perfect one, but the absence of the thing you needed it for. That choice, made in full awareness, made with the specific weight of everything the previous failure cost, is not naivety. It is the only kind of faithfulness that means anything.